lots of different things, right? And as we think of affordable housing, it's also a broad spectrum. You're probably not as familiar with the public housing program, public housing operations, as maybe some other types of affordable housing. So we want to talk to you about its faults, its successes, a little bit about how we got here as a country with our public housing stock, and some ways that it's getting better. We work primarily with the U.S. Department of Housing
We won't have time to delve too deeply into public housing's history today, but we just wanted to touch on a few of the high points which radically shaped the program and shapes kind of how we see public housing today. So the federal public housing program began in the 1930s as a means of housing families who fallen on hard times during the Great Depression, and also just as a means to help stimulate some economic activity. So the 1937 Housing Act officially started the public housing program, and the program was later expanded again through the 1949 Housing Act. While public housing did initially have quite a few supporters, it unfortunately has also always had plenty of opponents, specifically predominantly white and upper-class communities frequently fought against allowing public housing development in their communities, which then would often push these developments to areas of high poverty and high minority concentration. And then this, paired with many questionable design choices back in public housing's earliest days, specifically things like constructing many large high-rise public housing projects, led to the public housing program getting an increasingly bad reputation in the country. And unfortunately, public housing projects often ended up, rather than helping residents, more or less trapping them in these vicious cycles of poverty, where these residents were limited in their opportunities and their mobility. And to counteract this, some policies were enacted to hopefully resolve some of these issues, but many of these policy changes ended up having little effect or even backfiring in some instances. For one good example, there was an amendment to a 1968 Housing Act which capped rents in public housing properties, which this was a change meant to help public housing residents better afford their rents, which sounds great, but in actuality, while doing this, it reduced the revenue that public housing authorities were able to take in, which then led to further deterioration of many of these properties. So by the late 1980s, they ended up, the federal government had a commission formed, a commission on severely distressed public housing, and as a result of that commission, a new program was created, which is known as the Code 6 program. So this program, it provided grants to PHAs to redevelop their public housing properties as mixed income properties. Sorry. So this was a good idea in theory, but in implementation it actually caused quite a bit of significant harm in many communities. The Hope 6 program actually ended up displacing thousands of vulnerable residents, as not all public housing units that were demolished were actually rebuilt. And since it was mixed income housing, even if housing was rebuilt, it wasn't necessarily affordable to the prior tenants who had lived there. So this failure of the Hope 6 program, it was a crucial lesson that really shaped public housing repositioning as it is today, which we will talk about in a little bit. But so moving forward to the 1990s, it's important to note that in 1998, a major reform bill was passed, and most important for our purposes today is a small amendment known as the Faircloth Amendment, which this amendment, which was made by the senator who developed it, it prohibited PHAs from being able to use federal funding to develop new public housing units. So in essence, the amendment prohibited PHAs from developing any new public housing units beyond the number of units they maintained in the year 1999. So this seems like a small detail that you kind of file away in the back of your mind, as this will come back into play later when we talk about some of the modern day repositioning programs for PHAs. But then with that basically brings us back to modern day and our modern era, which you can kind of consider an era of public housing repositioning, which is kind of what a lot of the remainder of this presentation will be about. So this is about learning from the past and providing new opportunities and new hope for public housing authorities to stabilize their finances, improve their properties, and better serve their residents. So we'll be discussing many of these programs and opportunities throughout the presentation, such as the RAD program that was founded in 2012. But first I want to turn back really quickly just to public housing authorities today, looking again at who they serve and of course why they trying their best to serve the roughly 1 million households that we depend on them. And so let's just look at some statistics here. About 800,000 families are served nationally by public housing. Of these families, there's an average household income is about $19,000. About 34% of those households have children, 38% of those have an elderly household member, and 23% of those families have someone with a disability. And in Indiana specifically, about 9,000 families are served to this day by public housing, having an average household income of about $16,000. 34% of those households having children, 33% having an elderly household member, and 24% having a disabled household member. So we'll be talking a bit about income limits and who qualifies for public housing on the next slide. But for now, I just want to note that public housing to this day serves a very wide range of people. From many of society's most vulnerable, like those in the lowest income bracket, the elderly on a fixed income, and people with disabilities, to even as many young adults and working families who just can't quite earn enough to afford rents on the open market. I like this point in this graphic a little bit. I did some browsing on Muncie's and Indeed.com while preparing these slides, and I won't name the exact company or the exact title, but for reference, assuming a single person working a 40-hour work week, working adults who could qualify for public housing in Muncie include a preschool teacher, an EMT, a food service worker, an administrative assistant, or a factory assembly worker. Okay, so for reference, and to just emphasize this fact here, these are the income limits for the Muncie metropolitan area for 2025. So to be eligible for public housing, you must be below 80% of area median income, which you can see here equates to about $47,500 for a single person or $67,000 for a family of 4. I can certainly say I made less than $47,550 in my first job out of college, as I'm sure many of us did. So all this to emphasize, PHA programs are so important, and they really provide much needed affordable housing for so many in our society, from young adults and families just starting out their working lives, to people who are like elderly and disabled, these very vulnerable populations who may live on a very fixed income. And as a reminder, public housing authority programs, they really make a difference, because through these programs, these tenants only have to pay 30% of their income towards rent. And you can compare that to our society nowadays, where a lot of people are paying half of their income or even more towards rent. So you can see how much a difference these programs can make in these people's lives. Okay, so with that as well, we just want to go a bit over some of the public housing challenges that PHAs tend to face these days. Many of these kind of have historical roots, but they also still ring true today. So diving first and foremost back into the big old lack of funding. So public housing funding from the federal government is subject to the congressional appropriations process, and as public housing is often not a hot political issue, and many politicians unfortunately still have bias against it, public housing funding is unfortunately often at the forefront of government spending cuts. There is actually a formula used to determine how much funding a PHA is eligible for, but congressional appropriations actually tend to not reach the level PHAs are due under that formula. So look at these charts, for example. You can see this first chart here, the Public Housing Operating Fund. This chart shows federal funding for Public Housing Authority's operating funds, which that is the subsidy used to cover the rents that are unable to be paid by tenants. You can only find data up to like 2021, I believe, for this chart. You can see that the actual appropriations provided over this period never quite reach how much funding the PHAs are eligible for. And likewise, the second chart below shows federal appropriations for capital funds, which those are the funds used for modernization projects of properties, things like repairing a leaky roof. So the capital fund allocation chart shows that, adjusted for inflation and as a percentage of GDP, public housing capital funding has are only up to the year 2021, but the 2022 to 2026 proposed budgets leave capital funding stagnant, despite the fact that material costs have risen significantly over the past half-decade, which I'm sure you can see how that could be a problem for these four public housing authorities. Another big challenge PHAs face is just uncertain support. I mean, as can be observed, PHAs eternally live in a world of political uncertainty, and they have to do their best to manage their properties the best they can, even not knowing how much funding they will be allocated the next year to pay for their administrative and capital costs. Which you can see that uncertainty is found in trying to start a long-term path for an agency or plan any large rehab projects. And of course, we have the issue of deteriorating properties, which has been historically a long-growing issue. With all this said, it's easy to see why, with the limited funding and lack of funding consistency, PHAs have like an estimated backlog of about $76 billion in capital repairs at this point. It's not uncommon for public housing properties, many of which are decades old by this point. It's not uncommon for these properties to deteriorate at a rate faster than the PHAs can continue maintaining them. And then we also have administrative issues and regulation issues. Because finally, it's worth noting that the public housing program puts a lot of administrative burdens on PHAs, and frequently new policy changes are placed upon PHAs with little clear guidance on how exactly to implement these changes. And public housing authorities also have to operate within many rules already. Certain money can only be spent on certain items, HUD restricts a PHA's ability to take out a loan against their properties and make repairs, and just things like that. So PHAs already operate in a very restricted environment, and there are a lot of rules and burdens placed on PHAs beyond that the private real estate management company would have to deal with. So it's obviously not a great moment for these authorities already on pretty fixed income as it is. So thus with all this in mind, it's just no wonder why many PHAs find the status quo unsustainable for the long term, and why they need to change their housing safe and sanitary for the future generations of people who are going to need it. So now Amber is going to jump in, and she's going to be discussing what exactly PHAs can do, what programs are available to PHAs wanting to preserve, maintain, and build new properties.
Okay, now we get into repositioning. So we've established that Congress states public housing funding, it's not sufficient, it's a roller coaster over the years, it's not keeping up with what it costs to actually maintain these properties. We also know that we have a lot of issues, both in terms of physical needs and making sure our housing stock that's deeply affordable meets the next generation of need. So Congress has passed some repositioning programs that are essentially moving from the public housing funding platform to the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program platform. That's what repositioning is. Public housing to Section 8. Section 8 has a lot of political support. There's a lot of multifamily property owners. There's a lot of business that is done with different types of voucher subsidy. It's considered a lot more politically stable and a lot more reliant for funding. So this idea that we can have much more stable funding under the voucher program, with that stable funding, Housing Authority and its development partner can go secure debt. They can take out a loan. They can get tax credits. It's able to say, I can predict what my financing is going to look like. You can't do that under the public housing program. I used to work at a housing authority. I did a budget. I had to do my budget in September. I wouldn't really know what my federal funding was until July. And that's crazy. Like, who in the private sector would run their properties like that? But that's very common in this kind of antiquated public housing model. The idea too of repositioning is improving the physical conditions and preserving the affordability. So just because it's repositioned doesn't mean that they can make it market rates and charge high rents, it still comes some restrictions, typically like a 30 to 40-year lease restriction on affordability. There's a few main programs that we'll talk about today for repositioning. The first major one is the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD. There's also the Section 18 Demolition and Disposition Program. These are all kind of overseen by HUD, and if you want to reposition, you have to get certain approvals. And then also the RAD Section 18 blends, and we'll talk about that. It's a bit of a hybrid of both of the programs. Okay. Again, repositioning, stable funding. You can get access to third-party public-private resources that are outside of the restriction of the public housing program to make up for the lack of federal funding. You leverage that funding. You can also, maintain local control. So the housing authority and its nonprofit typically would be in an ownership entity for any kind of redevelopment, and they're able to still kind of have that local control, even though it's not a traditional public housing program. The big one is the release of the Declaration of Trust. So this is a deed restriction that all public housing has. It essentially says you can't borrow against the property, you can't finance it unless it's under very strict public housing programs. So the opportunity of getting that DOT released and making sure the asset can operate more like the private sector is huge. You can take out a loan, you can get tax credit equity, all of that as the Declaration of Trust is released. Also, funds are unrestricted, although affordable housing doesn't cash flow a ton under the public housing program. If you were to generate some operating reserves, you're kind of restricted in how you spend that. It maybe is only for that property. You cannot take it and go build more affordable housing or expand your mission. So again, repositioning kind of gives housing authorities tools to, if they have a great property with some cash flow, they can use that to further their affordable housing mission elsewhere outside of the property. The big thing though is getting rents that are similar to fair market. So Cayla had the chart that showed operating subsidy and capital funds not keeping up with the pace of what it takes. There's a formula of how that's determined. It's often well below what fair market rents would be. So if these properties, we want them to be good properties, we want them to be well maintained, we want them to kind of be able to compete with the private market or be better, right? We want a lot of dignity in affordable housing. So it's only fair that the rents can be similar to fair market rents. And then having the option to have a voucher instead of public housing funding gets us a little bit closer to that. The Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, approved by Congress in 2012, has a few main points to it. Again, the rents are predictable. They are set by a formula, and a housing authority and development team would understand what its rents are, and that they would adjust annually by an operating cost adjustment factor. It's also responsible for solving 20-year capital needs. So anytime public housing is repositioned, it has to understand what the 20-year needs are and either renovate that up front or have a plan in place where it's able to finance those needs over 20 years. It's typically done by a capital needs assessment. It's a long process that goes through HUD approval. Again, they don't want to release public housing property and not ensure that it's good to go for the next 20 years, right? Also, there are robust tenant rights. So residents have the right to participate in the conversion process, have a voice in terms of what improvements are made. If they So originally HUD wanted the rents to be more based on fair markets, but Congress said, we won't approve this program and your ability to improve these properties unless it's cost neutral. So what HUD had to do is the formula that housing authorities were getting for rents based on operating subsidy capital funds had to match what they would receive in the Section 8 program. Now I just talked about how, public housing funding sucks. So how does that make sense? But in some markets across the country, the traditional first rollout of the RAD program did work. This chart is kind of an example of the tenants paying a portion of rent, $250. There's operating funds and capital funds. That's how kind of the money is stacked to support a unit under public housing. And then to the right, you can see the tenant still pays their portion of rent, and then the rest is housing assistance payment or Section 8 payment, so it's equal. But again, there wasn't enough revenue being generated to really impact the vast majority of properties across the country with some significant physical needs. So this is an example of some creativity at HUD where folks at HUD in the recapitalization office that oversee the RAD program we're talking with folks in the Special Application Center under the Section 18 program. Section 18 program has a tenant protection voucher that automatically can demand 110% of fair market rents. This is really nerdy, like technical HUD stuff, but the numbers are kind of where it's all at, right? So what they said is we want to get some of those Section 18 vouchers that can demand the higher rents, and we want to be able to have that income potential in some of our RAD properties, because we're seeing that these properties aren't able to generate the kind of income that they need to support, the debt to make their repairs, etc. So they came up with these blends, and so based on the amount of repairs made, housing authority property can get more of these tenant protection vouchers. So I will say this is a huge improvement that each unit, the subsidy potential increases, and therefore income, debt potential, etc. increases. It just leads to more money for repairs. So the blends are huge. If a property wanted to demolish and rebuild, all of those kinds of things, they're able to attract these higher value voucher types. Again, I think it's important to understand that the residents are still paying 30% of their adjusted monthly income towards rents. So even though we're maybe bringing in more rent potential, it's kind of just subsidy potential to the property.
Okay, now let's move on to the Section 18 demolition disposition program, which, as David just talked about, can be blended with the RAD program, but it is also its own separate program, which, as you can probably get from the name, through Section 18, housing authorities are able to demolish their properties, or they can disposition their properties, aka sell their properties. So, like Andrew was saying, the benefits to the project here is that if you go through Section 18, it allows a subsidy exchange from the public housing or Section 9 platform to these Section 8 tenant protection vouchers, which you can then project-base these vouchers at a particular site or unit. It's like if you have a public housing unit and you receive Section 18 approval, you can take that tenant protection voucher for that unit, which is the type of Section 8 voucher, similar to a housing choice voucher, and you can then apply that to that former public housing unit. And so that effectively then we turn that into a Section 8 unit with those higher rents. Okay, so of course, the benefit of the project is the PBV rents here can be set at 110% of fair market rents, which is often quite higher than RAD rents. Like Amber was saying, it can vary by communities. On a rare instance, the RAD rents could be higher than Section 18 or these fair market rents, but frequently these fair market rents are fairly significantly higher than ground rents, sometimes even more than doubling the rent potential. So for like just one example, I looked at one of the public housing sites. Amber and I are hoping to reposition in Honolulu, Hawaii. And for that particular site, the potential rent for a one-bedroom unit would be $883. But the potential project-based voucher rent for a one-bedroom unit, or in other words, a unit that would be funded through Section 18 or through Section 8 after a Section 18 did our dispo, the rent for that unit would be $2,257. So there's an approximately $1,500 difference between the RAD rents and the Section 8 rents that the housing authority could get in that distance. And that's per month for one unit. Think about how much that could add up for over a whole property over the course of the year. So then speaking of like options under Section 18, there's two parts of it. You can get a demolition under Section 18 or demolition approval. You can get disposition approval, or you can get a demolition approval. So some common ways we'll see these used. For the demolition part, this is often if a PHA has properties that aren't needed, maybe they're in too rough a shape to rehab, or maybe they just want to clear the site and prepare it for future development. In terms of disposition, sometimes PHAs just want to sell units on the open market. Maybe again, if these units are unneeded, maybe it's a bad location, or significant damage that we still have the money to repair. And then from selling these units, the PHA can then generate money, which they can use to just stabilize their finances, or to even rehab their other properties. And a common one we also see is disposing of property through a development partnership, which then PHAs would often be a part of through a nonprofit affiliate. So in these cases, the PHA would sell or lease their property to a development partnership for some very small medial sum. And then the development partnership would have the money or would have the ability to acquire financing that would be necessary to rehab or even completely redevelop these properties. And these would be like funding sources like LIHTC, or low-income housing tax credits, or loans that would be inaccessible to these properties as public housing. So the big catch though with the Section 18 program is it does have certain justifications you're required to meet in order to qualify for the program. And you can see those justifications here. To just touch on a couple of common examples, like the first one here is what's known as physical obsolescence. So for physical obsolescence, a PHA has to undergo this big physical analysis of their property, and they have to be able to generate a report that shows that the cost of rehabilitating their property is greater than approximately 60% the cost of just redeveloping the site. So that can be a quite difficult bar to reach in a lot of cases, but many of the nation's oldest public housing properties, some properties have had some extended periods of deferred maintenance, and properties that suffered from freak events like natural disasters, many of them are still able to qualify for that. Another common justification is scattered sites. So to meet the scattered site justification, the PHA has to have, or these units have to be 4 or fewer units on one city block, and the PHA has to demonstrate how a lack of uniformity of systems and a distance between the properties make them difficult to continue operating as public housing. This is also an important one, as many PHAs in the country own single-family homes throughout their communities, and this is a way PHAs in that situation can sell these properties, often either on the open market to reduce the burden of managing these units, or to their nonprofit affiliate, in which case the PHA will continue to manage the units, just with more stable Section 8 funding. And so just kind of to put a little bit of an example to some of these justifications, I have a couple images here. First one is a kitchen from a public housing unit. This is just an example of, this might be a good unit where it could qualify for physical obsolescence. And the second one here is a FEMA flood map, which, so if your property is in a floodway, this section here is red and blue lines. If there's a public housing property in the floodway, that automatically would qualify for Section 18, as that would be a health and safety risk to residents. So the thing is, each of these justifications have have to review these justifications and eligibility criteria to see if any of their properties could meet these justifications. And finally, we'll be talking about a pretty new program on the repositioning scene, and that is the Restore Rebuild program, which was formerly known as Faircloth to RAD. So remember we touched earlier on the Faircloth Amendment. Again, that was that 1990s legislation that said PHAs could not build new public housing in excess of the number of units that PHA had in 1999. But through that legislation, we have what's known as the PHA's Faircloth Authority, which is the number of public housing authorities or number of public housing units PHA had in 1999. And that's the number of units that the federal government would be willing to fund. So just for an example, let's say a PHA has 1,000 units and undergoes a Section 18 disposition for, say, 100 units. After the disposition, these 100 units are technically no longer in the PHA public housing portfolio, and the PHA has 100 fewer public housing units in their Faircloth authority. But so rather than just being lost, the PHA can actually build up to 100 new public housing units to reach back up to their Faircloth authority. So this leaves open this great avenue for PHA to be able to develop new affordable housing units in their community. As of 2023, there were about 260,000 unused units of Faircloth authority in this country. Or in other words, that's 260,000 new housing units that could be built for low-income families, and these units would be subsidized through HUD. But so essentially all that to say, that is the basis for this new HUD program of Restore Rebuild, which guidance was released for in the early 2020s. So in this program, PHAs can build new public housing units and then build new public housing units out to their Faircloth limit, and then right after construction, the PHA can convert these new units to RAD units under the Rental Assistance Administration. The big problem with this program at this point in time is that the rents generated through these units are frequently insufficient to pay the high development costs needed for these new projects. As remember, the rents for newly constructed Restore Rebuild units are these RAD rents, which are based on public housing rents and tend to be quite low. And even beyond that, the public housing rents are based on, among other things, the age of the property, which since these are brand new properties is quite low. So yeah, these rents even tend to be lower than your typical public housing RAD rents. So while this program is great in theory, it is quite difficult as of now to make these Restore Rebuild deals pencil out. But yeah, while it's not perfect, some clever PHAs and developers have been finding ways to make the program work despite its shortcomings, and they frequently can use Restore Rebuild alongside other repositioning tools to provide higher rental revenues. So ultimately, I guess at this same time will tell where this program will lead. It does have great potential, but it can just be hard to make these deals work in our current economic climate. But hopefully through time and continued refinement of the program, we can see it become more accessible and more commonly used, as it does pose a great potential for building new affordable housing and helping communities to alleviate their housing affordability crises.
Okay. Repositioning is a really big deal. It's no going back after a housing authority decides to do it. As Cayla was saying, there's lots of iterations about these programs. There's a lot of things playing out in each housing market. I think, not speaking for every housing authority director, but a lot of them are studying it. How does it fit their portfolio? What kind of characteristics in their community are maybe hindered or helped by repositioning efforts? There's a lot to think about. Housing authorities are also governed typically by a 5 or 7 member board of commissioners, and those folks are also, responsible for maintaining safe, decent, sanitary housing, operating housing authorities programs as well. There's a lot that goes into these decisions. A senior population that's going to need 1 bedrooms, but the community doesn't really have any 1 bedrooms. Is there a way that the Housing Authority, through its repositioning efforts, could help add some of those units to their local housing market? What do the residents want? How can we engage the residents in the process? Financial capacity. What money do we have access to? How much do we need? What are our capital needs? As a housing authority, do we have a lot of reserves? Or do we have money from a sale of a property, etc.? How can we be financially resilient if we choose to do this? Organizational capacity. I say housing authorities are used to administering these programs. The staff is trained on very specific rules. Repositioning involves things like tax credits or other types of financing that has a lot of stakeholder involvement and compliance. Working with property management or compliance team to get staff trained. Repositioning is kind of slowly steering a big ship. You kind of have to think about, your organizational capacity, where you are today and where you want to be in 3 to 5 years, and how to get there. And also control. So typically, if a housing authority wants to do a major rehab project or repositioning effort, they're going to partner with a co-developer. So typically a nonprofit or for-profit development entity that specializes in tax credit development, securing financing. Maybe they have a general contracting arm of their company. They are going to want to set up some business terms. They're going to want to maybe have a stake in the ownership or not. They're going to want some developer fees, etc. So, kind of how does the housing authority want to shape what that long-term ownership or, long-term control, property management of the site, what does that look like? Development process. So this is whether you're repositioning under the RAD program or maybe redeveloping under Section 18. There's a lot that goes into rehab or new construction. This is where D3G excels as well. We help with strategic planning, kind of what we just went through on the previous slide. We help with resident engagement. There are specific regulations about how residents have to be involved. We also shine some of the pre-development activities. So pre-development is probably 12 to 18 months of work where you're doing your capital needs assessments, you're doing environmental reviews. Hopefully you don't have soil contamination issues or historic preservation. Maybe there's an underground storage tank that needs to be removed. All of this stuff kind of comes out during the environmental review process. It needs to be resolved before certain types of funding can be approved for your project. There's also management of the design process. So it's probably architects, engineers, general contractors that are helping a team figure out what the scope of work will be for rehabbing the projects, maybe doing some site improvements, also obtaining some local permits. There's financing, so a co-development partner or sometimes some of the larger housing authorities that have done a lot of self-development work, they are applying for low-income housing tax credits. So might have been discussed at some previous meetings, but one of the top ways of financing affordable housing rehab or construction in our country is the low-income housing tax credit program. You apply through the state, and the state allocates those on a competitive basis. It's very complicated. Housing authorities weren't necessarily developed to apply for and operate a tax credit program, so sometimes they bring in these experts to help secure financing. You're also going out and you're asking for probably a construction loan, a permanent loan. Development partners have relationships with those lenders, those banks. They know those complicated underwriting processes. You really want to try to build this team that has this expertise. all of those kinds of things. So it is not cheap, it is very risky, this stuff is very complicated. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it, and they're not, because again, I know we're getting into a lot of detail here today, and it's all very technical, but part of that is just why it's so hard to meet some affordable housing needs in our country, because it really is challenging, and it's expensive, and it's risky. Typical types of financing that we see public housing properties use for repositioning or redevelopment. First mortgage debt, a lot of FHA insured products. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but 221 DF, we see a lot of, basically has a lower interest rate for affordable housing than a conventional debt product. We do see conventional debt, so a developer is going to like a Chase Bank or Wells Fargo and asking for construction loan or permanent debt. You can still go the conventional route. Equity, so equity is low-income housing tax credits. A lot of 4% tax credits paired with tax-exempt bonds. We see some 9% deals, although those are kind of rare for a lot of public housing rehab work. We also see some historic tax credits. The Housing Authority can use some of their funds, so they can, if they have reserves in terms of operating funds, capital funds, or any proceeds, those can be used. And then the last one, other sources, usually a city, a locality, maybe has some community development block grants or home funds. And then the last one is the Federal Home Loan Bank Affordable Housing Program. That can also be another source. Okay, example projects. We want to show you what people are doing across the country and what this looks like. Okay, I used to be the director of the Bloomington Housing Authority for about 5 years. I worked at that entity for 10 years. Wonderful housing authority, challenging housing environment due to the student rental market there, very expensive housing market, very low wages for residents of Bloomington. So what we wanted for the housing authority is to move away from just administering the public housing program, the voucher program, and we wanted to be a real estate development company with a deep affordable mission. We saw repositioning the 312 public housing units that we had owned and operate as a way to be catalyst to jumpstart our way to be affordable housing developers. So we had some good properties, they had some needs, we had some money, but we didn't have experience getting all the financing. We didn't have experience with general contracting. It was a little bit too technical for us. So we went through a competitive procurement process and hired a company out of Chicago called Grimshore Development. And they were our co-development partner for 2 of our public housing sites. We went through the RAD Section 18 blend program. Our first deal closed in May of 2020. Going through COVID and closing a RAD deal was one of the most stressful times in my life, but we did it. We were able to leverage with those 2 transactions $75 million to completely rehab our public housing stock. Pretty significant rehab. We had also owned and operated all the utilities. We were able to upgrade those and turn them back over to the utility company. Significant improvement. We also, with the, again, catalyst, using repositioning to kind of jumpstart our real estate development efforts, we started a nonprofit, Sun Hill Community Development Corporation, that's in the ownership entity of those converted public housing properties, but I also went on to do a permanent supportive housing project, so affordable units for those experiencing homelessness. They can enter into the continuum of care and be assigned a unit with supportive services. That's the middle picture, core development. If you're familiar with some say that if you were a child growing up in that area, you had access to high quality care from newborn through the Head Start program, all the way to our excellent Boys and Girls Club in that neighborhood. So that project was to provide that high quality care with some rental, and again, it came about because we changed our mindset of not just administering programs, but being more of a developer. And then today, they're still working on some single family home ownership through that nonprofit and a community land trust. But just to give you an idea, Bloomington and Crestmont community, it was 196 units. Ultimately, it ended up being 204. We added some accessible units, so folks with mobility impairments, we added some units. It was a turnkey development, meaning that our development partner, we did not want in the long-term ownership structure. We wanted them to help us finance it and renovate it and get out. We don't want you in our business long-term. We spent about $165,000 per unit in hard construction costs. And yeah, just a little bit of the sources, the mortgage chase, tax credit equity, seller financing. We had some capital funds in project reserves, about $2 million. Income during construction, and deferred a little bit of the developer fee. So that's kind of what the financing looked like for one of the transactions. We're also working in Terre Haute. So the Terre Haute Housing Authority is doing a complete repositioning of its entire portfolio. It closed a deal, Honey Creek Village, late last year, and then they're doing some significant rehab that should wrap up in 2026. For them, this is kind of a bit of what their financing looks like. Acquisition about $14 million. They're spending about $25 million on hard costs, relocation, expenses, soft costs, those professional fees, etc., financing fees, contribute to some reserves, developer fee, and total about $50 million. I didn't touch on this much, but why do people do affordable housing development? What's the incentive? The properties aren't generating a ton of income. You make your money on the developer fee side. That's how developers and housing authorities, that's why we take all the risk.
And I can touch on the Anderson Housing Authority, which we have a lovely representative of today. So the Anderson Housing Authority has 117 public housing units, 33 single family, and 2 larger multi-family projects. So just kind of start back from the beginning of D3Q's involvement here. A few years back, D3Q did a repositioning study for the Anderson Housing Authority. And so that essentially meant D3Q collected data on the housing authority's properties and their operating expenses, and also just what their long-term goals were for the properties. And then D3Q examines the eligibility for these potential repositioning programs, just things like could it qualify for Section 18, things like that. And then financial models are created, which then show possible repositioning pathways, showing what the potential rental revenue would be if they go a particular route, and then how much debt and therefore how much rehab work each model could support. This information then forms a repositioning plan, which of course subject to the housing authority's review and approval, spells out the programs and timelines and on which the housing authority repositions their properties. So yeah, in terms of Anderson's particular plan, the first stage of the process dealt with the single family homes that Anderson had throughout their community. So they're actually going a very unique, like 2 avenues with that one. Some units are going to be sold on the open market, just a few units that are not cost effective to repair. And then the remainder of Anderson's single family scattered sites are going to be dispositioned, aka sold to their nonprofit affiliate for a nominal fee. And so the sale of these units will be below fair market value. So of course, there'll be a use restriction on these properties requiring them to remain affordable for the next 30 years. And these units, once sold, of course, will no longer be funded through the public housing platform, but rather through the Section 8 convert the multifamily properties they currently have. And then as part of this blend, there will also be extensive rehab of these properties to make sure that these properties are long-term viable for decades into the future. And so this page is like to highlight just what a change it can make from switching from public housing to the Section 8 platform. So just using Anderson's scattered sites for an example, these 33 units as public housing generated about $340,000 annually. But when undergoing Section 18 and switching them to the Section 8 voucher program, these same 33 units can generate about $700,000 annually. So that's nearly double, or is that over double? I don't know. But anyway, the additional revenue that Anderson can gain through these come again from, not from the tenants. The tenants either way will be paying 30% of their income through the rent. But this is money coming from HUD that the Anderson Housing Authority can use to better maintain their properties going forward. So yeah, just imagine the additional difference this money can make as Anderson does manage their properties into the future. And it will allow the housing authority to be financially stable for years into the future. And will put the housing authority in a better position in the long term for reaching their long-term goals. Okay, this last example is just a little further away from home, but it's a really cool project that Amber and I have been a part of, and it's part of a repositioning effort through the Honolulu, Hawaii, or the Hawaii Public Housing Authority. So this repositioning effort is part of a very large multi-phase strategy to redevelop 13 public housing sites across the state of Hawaii. So through this master plan, the housing authority is going to dispose through Section 18 and demolish 13 properties, and then these properties will be leased at a nominal sum to a development partnership between the housing authority and their development partner. So the development partnership is going to then redevelop these sites one for one, so that all public housing units that are demolished are replaced, and over 10,000 new units, both affordable, workforce, and even market rate, are going to be added. And so all these new units or all these projects are going to be developed using low-income housing tax credits, bank loans, low-interest state loans, and a few other sources. They've even found ways to implement the Restore Rebuild program through this, even utilizing that subsidy for a few of these units. And so just to highlight one of these projects, we have this Mayor Right project, which can be seen here, and that is in downtown Honolulu, Hawaii. So this project aims to replace these current public housing units here, there's 363 of them, with 2,448 new units, which you can see what that new construction development will look like here. And so this is not just going to be all affordable units, it'll be a large mixed income and mixed use development. And so the goal is, rather than just being low income, it will be a more diverse community, and also will still provide additional affordable housing units beyond what's currently available at the site, but without concentrating poverty like had previously been done too often in housing authorities past. So the new amenities anticipated to be redeveloped on the site will include community rooms, gardens, courtyards, pools, and so much more. So yeah, this project is definitely a bit on a larger scale of what Amber and I typically work with, but we do think it's a really great example of just how transformative these projects can be, as here a dated public housing site is going to be transformed into this diverse, vibrant, transit-oriented community, while additional affordable housing units will be created, while also allowing workforce and even market rate housing for the community.
There's no one-size-fits-all for housing authorities or the properties they own, operate. This stuff is very complex. It's not an easy decision to make. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. But hopefully today we sort of talked a little bit more about this critical housing stock. It provides such deep affordability. Housing authorities are such powerful providers of housing in communities. They're not perfect, but they are resilient. Sometimes the tools just aren't quite the perfect match for what the community needs. But yeah, I think our goal today was to kind of illustrate the complexities, some potential solutions, and kind of hopefully make you an advocate for good public housing authority operations and creativity and resilience moving forward. So thanks for the time, and hopefully it wasn't too technical. I also just wanted to say Kim Thompson, the CEO and Director of the Anderson Housing Authority and Anderson Housing Inc., their nonprofit, is here. She's also the president of our Indiana chapter of the National Affordable Housing and Redevelopment Officials, or NARO, which is our advocacy agency for public housing. She's really active in women in affordable housing network, or WAN, all of that. So she's a great resource for our area as well. So thanks for coming here.
Any questions?